I love the topic of long-term memory because it's so relatable. Whether they're speaking of mnemonic devices or other things like that, it's amazing how relatable it is. I think some of the experiments that we spoke of before with respect to sensory memory and that sort of thing were less relatable, and took a little bit of a stretch to understand some of those really fine experiments, but this is a better chapter, as will be chapter 7, especially when it comes to the mistakes that are made with long-term memory. If you'll indulge, just a few sentences I want to read. In the modal model, long-term memory is thought to differ than short-term in a few ways. It's described as a place for storing large amounts of information for indefinite periods of time. So that could be a day or one's entire existence, and in my case, 54 years. The contrast here with the modal description of short-term memory is holding a very limited amount of information for a short period of time. In other words, long-term memory is commonly thought to be a mental treasure chest or a scrapbook, and you can imagine that it is. And imagine the obscure facts that you know in semantic memory, like the periodic table symbol for gold, or episodic memory, whether or not you went to the prom, and if you did, do they have a DJ or a band? I know my prom was 36 years ago in March. We had our prom in March for some reason, and it was bitterly cold. My high school was up essentially in the Midwest in Louisville, Kentucky, and why we had it in March is a mystery. I don't know, because you are chancing it with weather, and sure enough, we had a rather rough day that day. Night, I should say. Now, the capacity of long-term memory tried to provide a more quantitative estimate of long-term capacity. So this Landauer, he began with two estimates. The first, that the size of human memory is equal to the number of synapses in the cortex. Another estimate is 10 to the 20th bits of information, the estimated number of neural impulses or messages that are transmitted. So you've got a lot of different estimates of the capacity of long-term memory, but the broad suggestion is that it's essentially infinite, and it's very difficult to imagine overtaxing memory to the degree that you would ever run out of space. I think this popular expression that we only use 10% is probably flawed. I don't think that's realistic. I think it's probably quite a bit more than that, or less, I should say. We've got more capacity than 90% left over. So whatever the actual number of bits of information, not all that information is retrievable, of course. So I may remember things from high school calculus that would look familiar on inspection, but I can't retrieve it. Or I might remember who succeeded Abe Lincoln after he was shot in 1865, but I can't really strain to get it right away. And then something gives me the clue that it was Andrew Johnson, our 17th president. So there are many everyday examples of failure to retrieve. And you meet someone you know you can't place, or you think of a word you can't name. That information is in your long-term storage somewhere, but you can't access it. I had an experience, speaking of seeing somebody that you know and you can't, and you strain to retrieve who they are. I grew up in Louisville, Kentucky, which is basically right above, beneath Indiana. So it's fairly far north. It's just a day's drive from Madison, Wisconsin, or the Great Lakes, or Buffalo. And I go to grad school in Tuscaloosa, which is, oh my gosh, I want to say in the neighborhood of 600 miles away. Quite a drive. And on my first few weeks there, there's a guy in the student union that I see that was hung out at my swimming pool that I went to when I was a young kid. So I was mid-20s when I started grad school, and I wouldn't have seen this guy since I was roughly 10 years old. So I guess, 15 years or so. And I'm looking at him and he's looking at me, and we can't place each other, but we were still young enough that we looked familiar to each other, given our childhood experience. And finally we spoke to each other, and sure enough, he was a Louisville native, they pronounce it Louisville. And it was one of those classic examples where I recognized something, but I couldn't come up with the context. And it took a little while to figure out we were from the same part of Louisville, Kentucky, that's on the eastern part. So it was kind of an exciting thing. But anyway, this capacity is infinite. How do we retrieve things and how we forget is one of the things that we'll talk about.